Welcome back, one and all, to the latest edition of the Future So Right podcast. I'm your host, Pete Beal. This is a Green Flame Press production, and welcome back for another episode. I'd like to start out by thanking everyone who tuned in to our last podcast, talking about second drafts. If you missed that, would like to check it out, it's going to be available in the pinned comment down below. Of course, if you make sure you hit that red subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner, you'll never need to worry about missing out on an episode. Just something to think about. And if you enjoy the content today, please consider leaving a thumbs up, comment, let us know how you enjoy the show. So the topic of the day is going to be a fun one, I think. It's one that I enjoy talking about, a part of the writing process that I really enjoy, and that's going to be writing fight scenes. They can certainly be the highlight of a lot of books, can't they? Especially if we do a good job, and we're going to talk about this at a bit more length later on in the episode, of properly building up to them. So I don't see any need to have any more of a long drawn-out intro. Let's dive right into the fun stuff. So, sit back, relax, enjoy the show. Let's talk about writing fight scenes. So let's start with a little bit of an assignment for you. I want you to think about, maybe make a list of your favorite 3 to 5 fight scenes in books. If it helps, go back and reread these scenes and really think about what it is about these scenes that makes you love them so much. For everyone, this is going to be a little bit different because we all have our own tastes and our own preferences. So this isn't necessarily a step you need to share with anyone in your process, but it's a good thing to get into your mind. What are those few fight scenes that really stand out? They can be, for example, a single combat hand-to-hand fight scene, or they could be a huge sprawling epic battle type of fight scene. Doesn't really matter. What matters more so is figure out which are your favorites and then think a little bit about what makes them your favorites, and that's going to help you as we move into the next step here. Okay, so do you have your handful of favorite fight scenes in mind? Maybe even written down? Good work. If you have that, let's go ahead and move on to the first step of the process. So now what you need to do is you need to decide essentially what the rules of combat in your book are going to be. Now what I mean by this is, are you going to have, say, crazy, ludicrous Dragon Ball Z type combat in your book? If so, that's fine. You just need to establish those rules early on. Likewise, if you're writing a book, say, with a realistic setting where you're setting it in the modern world, writing that type of fight scene might not necessarily be the best option for you. You might want to opt for something more realistic. If you're like me and you write in the fantasy genre, which sort of falls into the middle, again, you have to decide exactly how far you're going to push things. So, for example, in my books, there is combat. However, I try to keep it, especially the physical aspects of the combat, as close to real world, so to speak, as possible. The big twist, of course, being in fantasy, there's the element of magic. And in particular, my first trilogy, there's a character that has magical abilities, and I had to learn how to incorporate those abilities into that character's fight sequences. But apart from that, the combat I try to keep as realistic as possible. I don't want, for example, characters absorbing just insane amounts of punishment, absurd injuries, and then just popping right back up and keeping on fighting. I don't want a situation where, there's one character taking on an army of 500. To me, that's just not realistic. There are several instances where characters are outnumbered, but I try to approach those in a way where, okay, if this character is outnumbered and they're going to win the fight, how exactly is that happening? in a way that could potentially be plausible in a real world scenario. So, right out of the gate, establish your rules. Are there rules? I would assume there would be at least some form, but are we going for hyper realistic combat, or more like I mentioned earlier, the Dragon Ball Z Mortal Kombat type of combat? Both are valid and both have their places, but what you definitely don't want to do is start switching between the two throughout your work. Pick a rule set and stick to it. So once you decide sort of the rules that you're going to abide by when writing your combat scenes, the next thing you need to decide is essentially your writing style for these scenes. And by that I mean, are you going to go into extreme detail? Uh, the most obvious example I can think of for this would be R.A. Salvatore. If you've never read, for example, one of his Drizzt books and you want an example of this, pick up one of his Drizzt books. Sorry, look at my shelf. Homeland. Pick up Homeland by R.A. Salvatore. You're going to get very detailed combat in there, done very well. Now, in my personal opinion, there aren't a lot of authors that are honestly capable of pulling off his level of detail with the effectiveness that he does. And honestly, it's a matter of taste. Some people don't like his combat scenes. I love them, but when I've read other authors who try to replicate it, I don't love it as much. Some authors, I would say more authors than not, prefer to leave a little bit to the reader's imagination. They'll give you the details, but not in such vivid, blow by blow steps. And this is sort of the category that I fall into. Yes, I'll give you a good breakdown of what happens in a fight, but I'm not going to go, say, to the Salvatore level of he twitched his left arm upward and then his right arm came in at a 90-degree angle. I can't do that to the level that I would expect of myself, and so I don't do it. So, what I recommend, try doing this in a few different ways. Try a really detailed description, try a more vague description. Which one do you like better? Does it fall somewhere in the middle? Well, then sit down and try to figure out how to reconcile those two different scenes. But write the same fight scene in a few different styles. It's a great practice for yourself, not only for writing fight scenes, but honestly just for writing in general. But it's also going to help you identify what your favorite style is. What works best for your characters, what works best for your story. This is another place where our earlier assignment about going back and reading some of our favorite fight scenes could potentially be helpful, right? Because if you're finding a certain trend in terms of the writing style of those scenes, maybe that's a little bit of a hint of how you want to structure your own writing. Now that we've talked a little bit about the nitty-gritty process of actually writing out a fight scene, let's talk a little bit about what, in my opinion, separates a potentially good fight scene from a great fight scene. For me, the truly great fight scenes are going to be fights where there are real stakes, where there are real consequences for the victor and the loser. It's great and it can be a lot of fun to have just two badass characters throw down for the fun of it. In principle, there's nothing wrong with that. It can make for a very exciting scene. But wouldn't it be better to have these two badass characters throwing down for reasons that really matter to the story, where the reader understands that the result of this fight is going to have a major impact going forward on these characters, on the story, on the entire world that you've gone out and built? I'm going to give you an example, and this is actually going to be a movie example. It's going to be from Star Wars. So, potential spoiler alert if you're one of those people who has never seen Star Wars and still plans to see the Star Wars movies at this point. In Return of the Jedi, there's an outstanding one-on-one fight scene at the end of the movie between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. In my opinion, one of the best fight sequences in the entire series. They have something around what they have. I can't even keep track. Is it like 11 films now? But in my opinion, for my money, that might be the best one. And it's not because necessarily of how the fight looks. This was filmed in the early 80s, and so the choreography and such just doesn't hold up, for example, to the choreography of the newer Star Wars movies. So what makes this fight my particular favorite? If it's not the physical action, it's the stakes, the emotion that are tied to it. Now, here comes the real spoilers. In case you haven't seen episodes 5 or 6 of Star Wars, spoiler alert. Okay, click away if you don't want the spoiler. Luke Skywalker found out in the previous film that Darth Vader is his father. Darth Vader is obviously an evil character, trying to bring about the destruction of the Rebel Alliance and such. Luke Skywalker is trying to stop him, and they end up meeting in this final battle aboard the Death Star. So going into this, there are so many things at stake. And this is going to determine really how this film ends. We know, for example, that all of Luke's friends are currently involved in a large-scale battle trying to defeat the Empire. We understand that if Luke's not able to overcome Darth Vader might well end up killing all of his friends. The filmmakers set the scene beautifully in a dark throne room type of atmosphere. The characters had a conversation prior to their battle where Luke's trying to convince his father that he's not evil at heart, that there's still good in him, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's a great example of a fight scene that's set up very well. Another great aspect of this particular fight scene is that they had fought in the previous movie and Luke lost. So that just raises the stakes even higher. It gives you a higher sense of anxiety, thinking, oh no, our good guy's already lost to this guy once. Oh no, is he going to lose again? What's going to happen this time? Last time he got his hand cut off. What's going to happen this time? So all of these are great little elements that the filmmakers threw in to create not just a visually great fight scene, but an emotionally fantastic fight scene. And I'll say it again, that to me is what separates the good fight scenes from the great ones. A good one can be, oh man, that was so cool that those two threw down. But a great one is one that makes you feel things leading into it, perhaps anxiety for a certain character, perhaps hope that it will go a certain way. It continues those feelings and emotions during the fight scene. Perhaps when the character you're rooting for looks like they're in a bit of trouble, you get anxiety, you get worried. And when it's over, you should be able to sit back and think about, wow, if that had gone the other way, this, and this would have happened. This one particular scene between these two characters, or these two armies, or these two factions, whatever it is, really determined the course of the story going forward. It wasn't just a fun fight for the sake of having a fun fight. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to me, those can be good, but they're not necessarily great. I almost don't like doing this because it feels gratuitous, but I'm going to go ahead and give you an example of a fight scene that I thought was good, but it wasn't great. And then I'm going to explain why I felt that way. So this, again, potential spoilers. We're talking about the TV show Game of Thrones, based on the George Martin books. Specifically, we're talking about the last season of Game of Thrones, and I'm guessing some of you are probably already agreeing with me just because you didn't like the last season of Game of Thrones. But let's dive into this anyway. Throughout the entire series, there's a lot of anticipation that there was going to be a fight between two characters in particular. Those being the Clegane brothers, the Mountain and the Hound. There was build up for years and years. Everyone was waiting to see this fight. It's going to be incredible. Oh my gosh, we can't wait. Well, spoiler alert, last season, one of the last episodes, spoiler alert. Okay, you've had time to click away now, no excuses. These two brothers finally meet in a fight in, I believe it was like the second to last episode of the series. Now, from a visual standpoint, it was absolutely spectacular. It was, in many ways, exactly what we thought it would be. It was brutal, it was just savage, just these two big, strong guys beating the living hell out of each other. One could argue that, as far as choreography and such goes, it's far better than the fight sequence that I spoke about earlier. Here's my problem. The result of that fight had no impact on the story. None. If those two characters had never run into each other, would the story have been any different? I don't think it would have been. If you disagree with me, please leave it down in the comments below. If the fight had happened but ended differently, would that have changed the way the story ultimately ended up ending? I don't believe so. Again, if you disagree with me, I would love to discuss it. So we had all this build-up, all this animosity between these two characters. Everyone's excited to see it, and it looks great, but there's just no impact on the story, and that's so disappointing. It's so much different than, say, a certain trial by combat that happened much earlier in the series between the Mountain and Oberyn Martell, where the fight is also outstanding, but there's also really high stakes, and the viewer is actively anxious as they view it. Now, maybe viewers were actively anxious when they watched this, as it was affectionately known the Clegane Bowl. But in the end, looking back, I think most would agree, well, that was great that happened, but what was the real impact? It was two guys fighting each other because they hated each other, and we could sense that, we could get that emotion from it, but why couldn't it have had a larger impact on the overall story? Not meant just to take a shot at the last season of Game of Thrones, which I know a lot of people do, but it was just a legitimate beef that I had with that particular scene. Very cool fight scene, don't get me wrong, but why couldn't we have had just some impact to the story as a result of that fight? So there's another thing I want to touch on a little bit. When it comes to writing realistic combat, this won't apply so much to like the Mortal Kombat type fight scenes that we touched on a little bit earlier. But if you're trying to make your combat scenes realistic, understand that there have to be consequences. So let's say two characters get into a long, drawn-out fist fight. Now, one of them's going to win and one of them's going to lose, but more likely than not, both of them are going to walk away from this fight wearing it, so to speak. At the very least, they're going to have bruises, they're going to have cuts, maybe they have other injuries, maybe they broke a knuckle, maybe they broke a rib, something like that. So there need to be those type of consequences in order for the fight to be realistic. But in addition to that, those consequences have to be realistic in terms of recovery. Now, I don't care how much of a badass your character is, if they snap their leg in half during a fight, they're not going to be getting into another fight anytime soon. You need to convey that realistically to your reader. If you've gone your whole book writing realistic fight scenes and then you do something like this, your readers are going to cry foul. They're going to be waving their book in the air like, wait a minute, wait a minute. Why is all of a sudden this character able to just pop back up from a broken bone right away when every other fight scene in this book has been very realistic? So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind with realistic fight scenes, understand that in the real world, physical fights tend to not last very long. I mean, heck, you can even see, for example, boxing matches or mixed martial arts matches where you have two highly trained professionals going at it and the fight doesn't get out of the first round, right? This is even magnified when you have two people who aren't at that level or two people fighting each other in a non-controlled environment. These matters tend to resolve themselves, so to speak, very quickly. So, for example, let's say you're writing a scene where two characters get into a fight on like a city street. Well, one character punches another character, that character falls down and hits his head on the sidewalk, that fight's pretty much over already, right? At least if you're writing a realistic fight scene. So you don't necessarily need to think of your fight scenes as something that's going to be 10, 15, 20 pages long. At least talking small scale. If we're talking like a large scale battle sequence, that might be a different story. One piece of advice I would give anyone in terms of if you want to learn more about writing a realistic looking fight scene, go out and watch fights, to be honest. Now, I'm not saying go out on the street and start egging people on to fight each other, but maybe check out, for example, a few UFC fights, right? I love UFC, I love watching them. They'll give you a very realistic idea of what actual combat is like, what type of injuries can be inflicted, what sort of damage various types of strikes can do to the human body, and generally how long they last. Now, some fights go a full 25 minutes. Some fights are over inside 1 minute. Your book can vary in this way, too. One thing as a fantasy author that drives me a little bit nuts is when I see a fantasy book that has constant, really long, really drawn-out sword fights. Now, if you do any sort of research into history, you'll see that very few sword fights lasted very long. No, there's nothing wrong with having longer scenes. Again, we're writing, I'm assuming, fiction. So, yes, we can embellish. We can have fun with it. Especially if two major characters are involved. But if you have a fight scene between a major character and some random, just, generic bad guy, that doesn't need to turn into a 5-page fight sequence. There's nothing wrong with having your hero just run through someone every now and then because they're just that much better. It adds a sense of realism, and it makes it more exciting when they do run into someone that is a match for them. Okay, so I hope you haven't noticed, but my voice is starting to go. So let's dive into a little bit of sort of a quick hitter of some common mistakes that I see in fight scenes, in books, and in TV and movies too. First off, two people engaged in a fight, whether that be a fist fight or a fight to the death with swords or guns or any sort of weapons, are probably not going to talk to each other very much. They're going to be more focused on trying to hurt their opponent. This is especially bad in books. No, it's not just books, it's movies and TV too. That's okay. I'm wrong on that one. But in general, you see this a lot. And I think the reason this happens is because authors and directors and such think this adds a certain amount of drama to the scene. But if it's well written, it doesn't need extra drama. So, try to minimize dialogue during your fight scenes. A little bit's fine, especially, talking a little smack to each other at the beginning, whatever. But if they're having a full-blown conversation while they're fighting, that's going to come off as very unrealistic. Another mistake I see, very common in fantasy, is misusing or misunderstanding armor. So, for example, this goes two ways from my experience. Authors either think that armor is just invincible and it can withstand anything and it's going to protect your character from anything. Or they'll put your character in a set of armor and then act like it doesn't exist at all. Armor provides a certain amount of protection, but it's not, limitless. It's not going to protect you from every single type of injury. If you're wearing full plate armor and you get hit with a mace in the chest, you could still shatter your rib cage. You could still have very serious injuries. So, do a little bit of research on the type of armor you're using, if you're going to use it, and understand its limitations, understand its capabilities. Another common mistake I see is, and I think this really happens a lot in writing as opposed to any other medium, but they make it seem as if characters are taking turns during a fight scene. Like character A swings his sword at character B, who avoids it, and then swings his sword at character A. And it's an easy trap to fall into in writing because you don't have that visual medium to display to your reader, like, say, a TV or a movie does. One trick you could try to overcome this. So maybe have character A start their action, then describe a little bit about what character B is doing in response to it, and then describe a little bit, okay, this is what happens when those two actions come together. It'll flow a little bit better than, say, character A did this, this, and this, and then character B did this, this, and this. So try to flow very quickly between the characters. That's going to give you a little bit more realism. It's going to take away a bit of that turn-taking feel. Sort of a last little pet peeve. If your characters are going to be fighting with weapons, whether it be swords, guns, knives, try to learn a little bit about how an actual fight with that tool would work. I mean, how many times have you read a scene, for example, where a character is using a gun, and just from the way it's described, you feel like, has the author ever seen a gun before? So just do a little bit of research, learn how the weapon works. So sword, gun, spear, it doesn't matter. Just put in just a little bit of effort. Doesn't take that long. Figure out how it works. Here's a fun fact. Swords are heavy. I read a lot of fantasy books, so it seems like the author doesn't realize that. They swing their sword away endlessly for hours on end without getting tired. Kind of strange how that works. So this was a bit of a rapid fire section of just some things to be on the lookout for when you're doing your writing. Try not to fall into any of these traps. It's really easy to do. So if you've done it in the past, maybe you're going through a first draft and you find some of these, it's nothing to beat yourself up over. You're still learning. Still part of the process is learning and getting better all the time. So like I said, I'm starting to feel it a little bit in my voice. So I think we're going to start to wrap this one up. Do you have any tips or tricks for writing fight scenes? If so, I'd love for you to leave them in the comments down below. Never know who you might help. You can also submit your ideas to the podcast, my website, petebeal.com. That's linked down in the description below. You could talk about today's topic, or you could suggest a topic for a future episode, or ask a question. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed the content, please make sure you hit that thumbs up button. It really helps out. You can hit the red button in the bottom right hand corner to subscribe, be notified of future episodes. We'll be back with another episode in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, I'm also going to go ahead and share a little bit of news. My sequel novel, The Throne of Thornata, is available for pre-order now. I'll have links for that down below. It's the second book of the Raw Wielder trilogy. If you're interested in that, you can order it down below. I'll also leave the links for the first novel, The Path of the Raw Wielder, as well. Thank you so much to anyone who has purchased copies or ebooks. It's much appreciated. Oh, did I give you the date? The release is on May 17th. May 17th of 2022. Okay. I'm going to stop rambling. Let's go ahead and call this an episode. I do hope you enjoyed. Until next time, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and always keep writing. Thank you very much.